Hey everybody. So I mentioned a few days ago that I'm going to make a few videos related to Timothy Snyder's book on tyranny. And I suppose that this is the first of those videos, but these videos won't really be a review of the book or even a complete summary of it. Instead, what I'm planning to do is to just pull out a few key ideas and apply them to our current situation. So today I'm just pulling a few quotes from the prologue. And these quotes just helped me to sort through one of the hardest questions I had to confront this week. If you're not familiar with Timothy Snyder, he's a professor of history at Yale. And he's written incredibly well over the years about authoritarianism, like where it comes from, how it can take over a democracy, and most importantly, in his book on tyranny, what just normal people can do about it. So it's a very short book with 20 short lessons, things that he's learned from 20th century authoritarian movements. And it's a much easier read than some of his other books. He tends to write in a more academic style than this usually. So the question that he helped me to sort out in his prologue the other day is this. Why keep going? Why bother speaking out against Donald Trump and the MAGA movement if the country seems to want this stuff? I mean, like almost everybody else that I know, I've done a lot of soul searching since the American people chose Donald Trump last week. After everything we know about his character and about his past actions and about his stated intentions for the future. So the part that's most disturbing is that, once again, white evangelical Christians voted for Trump at about just over an 80% rate, it looks like. And I've had to ask myself if it was worth it to spend so many years writing books and making videos to warn people about the dangers of doing that, about the dangers of supporting Trump. I took a trip to Spain with my wife and some friends a couple months ago after I finished writing A Christian Case Against Donald Trump. We spent time in Barcelona and Madrid and a bunch of other beautiful places. And I fell in love with Madrid. It felt like the most livable major city I've ever visited. So people close to me know that during the run-up to the election, I had a standard response because they would often ask me what I planned to do if Donald Trump won. And I always said that if he won, I'd probably end up managing a Cinnabon in Madrid under an assumed name. And I was joking, of course, because I didn't actually see any Cinnabons in Madrid. But the struggle is real. The struggle to keep going in the face of such a stunning betrayal by people who call themselves Christians, a betrayal of our country, and I believe a betrayal of our faith by people who claim to have one job in the culture, to represent Christ as salt and light. People who call themselves Christians voted to force Donald Trump onto the nation, and now his toxic presence is going to be unavoidable for 4 more years. So, I mean, we can try to ignore him, and I think that's a healthy response by and large, but by voting for him at such a high rate, white evangelicals guaranteed that Donald Trump will be the most significant shaper of American culture for the next 4 years. And because they stubbornly refuse even now to acknowledge the obscenity of what they've done in Christ's name, they're ensuring that Donald Trump will also be the most powerful shaper of evangelicalism in the years to come. So for many of us, it's just tempting to leave the dead to bury their dead, or to shake the dust from our feet, or whatever metaphor we want to use to express our completely understandable desire to just chuck the whole enterprise, to tune out and drop out. But speaking strictly for myself, I simply can't do that. And reading Timothy Snyder's prologue helped unlock something in my thinking that seems obvious on the one hand, but it hit me in a new way reading it this time. And so let me say, just before I go any further, though, that I completely understand if some of my listeners are frustrated right now when I say it's even a possibility that some of us could drop out and ignore the damage Trump and his people might do. I just want to recognize that an awful lot of people don't have the privilege of ignoring the next 4 years. This feels like life and death to a lot of people. And not everyone has the option that I have of just quietly going about my life, providing for my family and just keeping my head down. So I get that. And that's the main reason I'm staying engaged and planning to increase my efforts to wake people up still to the dangers of the MAGA movement. But in a nutshell, here's why Christians specifically have to keep speaking out against Trump and his MAGA movement. First, because people who call themselves Christians gave us Trump in the first place. But second, because this is what we're designed for. I used that phrase salt and light earlier, and it comes from Matthew 5, where Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." Now, Jesus spoke these words to people who lived in a world that was a lot more messed up in many ways than our own world. And he spoke these words to people who had far less earthly power than most of us have. So followers of Jesus are called to be the light of the world. And a few passages later, Jesus tells us, "If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness?" Now, the fact that over 80% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump for a third time shows us that in some meaningful way, the light within the church in America has become darkness. So this brings me to a few quotes from the prologue to Timothy Snyder's book on tyranny. Snyder summarizes where authoritarian movements come from in the prologue, and he explained that our country's founders had studied Aristotle and Plato, and he writes, "Aristotle warned that inequality brought instability, while Plato believed that demagogues exploited free speech to install themselves as tyrants." So our founders built checks and balances into our system, but those checks and balances have never perfectly protected us from tyranny in this country. And so he writes this: "They had in mind the usurpation of power by a single individual or group, or the circumvention of law by rulers for their own benefit. Much of the succeeding political debate in the United States has concerned the problem of tyranny within American society, over slaves and women, for example." So did you hear that last line? Tyranny within American society over slaves and women. Tyranny and authoritarianism are so hard to talk about, and it seems like we always end up going to the example of Hitler. And I understand why people object to that comparison, and we don't need to go there. It's no secret, for example, that the Nazis themselves learned from some of the racist laws in the United States. You can read a lot of articles about that online. Here's one from Becky Little at history.com called "How the Nazis Were Inspired by Jim Crow." So Timothy Snyder mentions slavery and the legal subjugation of women, but we know that many other groups have been oppressed in our own fairly recent history in this country. My point isn't to trash on America. My point is to say that Christianity has been the dominant moral force in America for our entire history. And it hasn't saved us from abusing and oppressing entire groups of people. But that's not because of Jesus' teaching. It's because of what we do with the Bible. So when I warn about the MAGA movement, I'm not warning that the American church might slide into authoritarian abuse and oppression of the other for the first time. I'm warning that we're well on our way to doing it again. Authoritarian abuse is baked deep into the history of the church in America, and a lot of the people who want to make America great again are not being honest about where we've come from. And of course, some people never left that kind of thinking behind in the first place either, if we're honest. That impulse to dominate and control, to scapegoat some group of others in order to deal with our own hardships. We don't have to go to Germany in the early 20th century to find that. It's always been here, right here in America. And to a greater extent than a lot of us want to admit, it's been centered in our churches. So that impulse is right there, ready to be exploited by any strongman who knows just which buttons to push. So Snyder writes, both fascism and communism were responses to globalization, to the real and perceived inequalities it created, and the apparent helplessness of the democracies in addressing them. Fascists rejected reason in the name of will, denying objective truth in favor of a glorious myth articulated by leaders who claimed to give voice to the people. I can't think of a better description of the heart of the MAGA movement, a reaction to real and perceived inequalities, a rejection of reason in the name of will, and a denial of objective truth in favor of a glorious myth. Followers of Jesus have to come to terms with these things. We have to wrestle with these impulses in our own hearts, and we have to root these impulses out of our churches. We don't have the luxury any longer, and I'd say we never did, of ignoring these issues because they're too divisive or political. Millions of Christians pour into churches every Sunday and never hear about these things. And that's how over 80% of white evangelicals end up voting for a man who would take us right back to the cesspool of oppression that we've been in for most of our nation's history. In the book of Amos, God says to the people of Israel, I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. We have to speak out against injustice, not mobilize behind a leader who makes injustice and oppression his brand. I mentioned a few days ago that I was visiting a school in southern Minnesota the day after the election. It's a part of the state that I would guess went 80% for Trump. And I saw a kid on the school playground who was 10 or 11 years old with a red Trump hat on his head. And he was walking up to other little kids and he was yelling, Trump! Trump in their faces, just screaming it. And I can't guarantee this, but I'd be willing to bet quite a bit of money that that kid goes to Sunday school every week. I'll bet that his parents are loved and respected at his church. And that's not something new. That's not something Trump invented. When I wrote my book, MAGA Seduction, in 2020, I wasn't under any illusion that Trump was seducing the American church to do something they'd never done before. He was just the latest to come along and offer them what he knew they wanted. And he knew because he understood the dark side of the American church better than they understood themselves. So here we are. If that kid I saw was 10 years old, that means Donald Trump has been the primary political figure of his entire lifetime. He may have been 2 years old when Trump announced his first candidacy for president. If his parents or his church don't show him something better, in fact, if his parents give him the hat and tell him to wear it to school, what chance does that kid have? What chance does he have? I love America. I love our history, as complex and as mixed as it is. And I'm optimistic about our future, but I'm only optimistic because I believe we still have time to get our heart right. You can't follow Jesus and follow Trump. You can't. And however you may have voted, if you continue now to support Trump and his movement, then you're choosing the way of Trump over the way of Jesus. We're going to see this unfold in the coming months, and you'll see the way of Trump, and there's no way that you'll be able to honestly reconcile it with the way of Jesus. I mean, you can leave your comment for me if you want, telling me that you voted for his policies or the alternative was worse. I mean, I've heard it all, and I've answered those things like in 2 books and about 100 videos. So Next time you speak out in favor of Donald Trump or his MAGA movement, I just want you to think about a 10-year-old kid in southern Minnesota who wore a Trump hat to school the day after the election and shouted Trump's name in his classmates' faces. That's the world that you're building. You may be trying to make America great again, but all you're accomplishing is bringing us back to a world of abuse and oppression that we've been spending hundreds of years trying to rise above. So thanks for listening.